Welcome to Season 5 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former health commissioner here in Baltimore, Maryland. Our goal with this podcast is to bring scientific evidence and experience to shed light on critical health issues. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, Stephanie Desmond talks to Johns Hopkins' Paul Spiegel, an expert in humanitarian health. Dr. Spiegel is headed to Poland this week to help the WHO handle myriad health concerns among the massive number of refugees pouring out of Ukraine during the Russian invasion. They discuss the devastation of this war, how it's different from previous crises, and what the long-term consequences may be. Let's listen. Paul Spiegel, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, Stephanie.
So today, I really want to talk to you about the situation in Ukraine. It's been devastating to watch, and we feel incredibly helpless as we do. This appears to be, along with a military crisis, a public health crisis and a humanitarian crisis, and probably other things that I'm not even mentioning. So I'm curious if you could just sort of give us the landscape at the moment.
Sure. What is happening is devastating, clearly. It's an unprovoked war where millions and millions of people are affected directly and indirectly. And, what makes this unique in some ways, or at least different, is because it's happening in Europe and it has extremely large geopolitical significance. However, I want to also emphasize there are so many other crises going on. And what happens is there's often an overemphasis and media attention. Perhaps overemphasis is not the correct word. There's such an attention to what's happening here because it has such direct effects on everything from food supply to petrol and natural gas supply, that it does cause us to overlook what is happening elsewhere in the world.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk about public health. So what are the biggest public health concerns now in Ukraine?
Certainly trauma, probably number one, because of the amount of both for combatants as well as civilians that are now being affected by what appears to be sometimes indiscriminate shelling and sometimes very specifically going after civilians. So certainly trauma is number one. The other big issue relates to continuity of care. We have a population that is similar or even an older demographic profile than the United States because it does not have the same amount of immigration that we have. And therefore you have a lot of people, everything from common, bread and butter cardiac diseases and diabetes, to the more complex cancers, renal dialysis, and communicable diseases, HIV and TB, and all of this needs continuity of care. So that's going to be very difficult to do both in Ukraine proper, but also outside of Ukraine, as we have now over 1.7 million refugees moving into multiple countries. A couple other big areas that are really important is going to be mental health. The gravity and the trauma of seeing your country destroyed and seeing your, personal level, your home and your the death of loved ones is extremely difficult. And then finally, there are many others, but the other areas that we really need to look out and be careful about are epidemics. Luckily, the Ukraine has a high level of vaccinations in terms of expanded program of immunization. So for childhood vaccines, but there were some polio cases in the past, and there's certainly COVID, which is now coming down, but with Omicron, but it's still very, very it's concerning. And then waterborne diseases, of which because of the destruction and what is happening, it's easier to have diarrheal cases.
Since we've spent the last 2 years focused so much on COVID, I'm curious a little bit sort of about
does fighting exacerbate the infection, the infections, or I guess it's also crowding into shelters and then traveling across borders? I mean, talk to me about the scope of the problem.
Yeah. Firstly, absolutely, it's important. But I will say what I've seen, recently, or in November, December, I was in Afghanistan, and now I'll be heading out to Poland and to work with the refugees. And it's a lot of this is prioritization. So, well, of course, it's very important from a public health perspective, from a community or individual perspective. Right now, the people of Ukraine are going to be concentrating more on immediate life and death situations. But given that, there's a lot of concern about movement, people hunkering down in subway systems and in bunkers where obviously the airflow will not be the same as outside. Movement of people and soldiers. I mean, interestingly, the Ukraine population is about 35% vaccinated only, which is not a lot, but the Ukrainian army is 99%. And similarly, the Russian population is a much lower vaccination rate, but the military is much higher. And they've done this for precaution and to make sure for military readiness. But that is more on the transmission. And then the other aspect will be the supply side of what hospitals are some hospitals are being destroyed. Many people are moving outside, healthcare workers. So there may not be the enough healthcare workers to provide such treatment. There was already a problem with oxygen, and now the ICUs are going to be, those that are still functioning are going to be overloaded with trauma cases. So certainly the ability and the capacity to care for people with serious COVID will be undermined as well.
The depth of this, sort of what it's like to have to believe that you're not going to be attacked, and then to suddenly be overrun with a war, unlike I've really seen in my lifetime. I'm curious, sort of from a humanitarian angle, how does that complicate things, and what's being done?
It's interesting because I've been doing this for so long, but I've never been directly affected, such as the people. So I try to remain as empathic as I can. But what these people have gone through, I've never experienced. I can only imagine. But there are very few positive aspects to this. I mean, it's an unprovoked war, as you said, we didn't expect, or many didn't expect, it would be an all-out war, and I don't think people expected millions and millions of refugees, and this may only be the beginning. That being said, some of the positive aspects are that the surrounding European countries are accepting them with open arms. They're opening up healthcare systems, they're opening up their homes. But even those systems, Poland now is over, I believe it's 1.7 million refugees now just in Poland itself. So no matter what level of capacity in the health systems that you have, they're going to be overwhelmed. And therefore, we need to be able to try to think short term and longer term of how can countries accept and adapt to such a massive population coming in such an extremely short period of time.
So you're headed to Poland to help WHO with their work. Talk to me about what you will be doing when you get there.
Yeah, I'm going to help them with the refugee health response. So in all of the countries outside where the Ukrainians are fleeing to. What one does and what one thinks one will do is always different when one arrives there. But clearly, in this situation, we have competent, strong governments who will be working with the refugees. So much of what WHO and I will be doing will be supporting the governments who are accepting these refugees. But I imagine strengthening surveillance systems would be number one, examining the capacities of everything from the healthcare workers to the supplies. Whatever was planned for Poland in terms of supplies of medicines, and particularly those that are either very expensive or relatively less common diseases will quickly be used up, and therefore we're going to have to think about that and then the pipeline. Trying to help with basic health information systems to understand who are these people, what diseases do they currently have, and what may they develop. And the hardest part, especially is in Europe, where you have open borders, is that people may be coming into, let's say, Poland, and they may even be recorded as coming across the border from Ukraine to Poland. But within a couple of days, weeks, or certainly months, they may not stay there. They may move elsewhere. So it's trying to keep track of these people and ensure that they have access to care.
This will be a massive number of people being sent to, I guess, all of the European Union. Is there a concern that aren't the resources to help them beyond Poland at the moment?
Mm-hmm. There's always that concern, but realistically, most refugees throughout the world are in areas not as nearly well-resourced as the European Union. And so while that will certainly be a hardship on each of the countries, I think what we've seen with the EU countries themselves and the world is supporting them, a lot of resources will come in. And so while, of course, there will be problems and issues coming up, it'll be nothing like what happens in Nigeria and South Sudan and these other areas. So yes, of course, it's going to be challenging, but these are countries with well-trained and well-resourced healthcare systems.
I want to talk about sort of some of the more recent issues with refugees around Europe and the world. I still think about that photograph of the Syrian boy, who drowned and was found on the beach because the European Union didn't want to take him. And I'm curious why we are seeing so much support for the refugees from Ukraine as opposed to the refugees from Syria.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question, and it's hard. It's hard to say, and it's a hard fact, but there is a tremendous amount of discrimination everywhere in the world. And so, and this is one of the concerns, I think, that we will see, and rightfully so, an outpouring of white Europeans, Ukrainians leaving the country, and they deserve all the support that we can provide to them. But what a difference in systems where when you have Syrian refugees or you have migrants and refugees throughout the world that are coming into maybe our border in the US and the southern border or throughout Europe, and they're not accepted. And as a microcosm, we even saw the difference when refugees were trying to come out from Ukraine into Poland, and the Ukrainians, white Ukrainians, are able to, most are white, are able to cross the border, but you had students who were studying in Ukraine that were from Africa, and you had Indian workers, and they did not, at the beginning at least, I don't know what the situation is now, have the same access coming into Poland as the Ukrainians. So it's hurtful. The double standards that we see are extraordinary. And again, we don't want to take away from the need and the importance of what's happening here. But I imagine if you're a Syrian or you're a South Sudanese or you're someone from Yemen, you're looking, and Afghanistan, which is suffering so badly, you're looking around and you're saying, well, what about us? And rightly so. And it's so that part is disheartening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you surprised, but I guess we didn't really foresee this crisis. We didn't really think this was going to be a full-blown war, especially, less than 2 weeks since it started.
Yeah. Interestingly, the US and the UK, from the intelligence that they were openly, discussing this, they did mention, these two countries particularly mentioned that this could be a possibility. I think most of us didn't want to accept it or to really think this could happen. It did happen. And, the only similar crises, I would say the most recent one was Kosovo, and then the Balkans, Serbia, Croatia, etc., ex-Yugoslavic countries, and that was a while back. And so it's extraordinary to see. And certainly there is an issue of just ethnicity, Caucasian, Europeans. But there is also the issue of geopolitical interest. And I think that's important to understand. And there, perhaps it's a little bit understandable because countries are ultimately, the governments need to represent their populations. And clearly the repercussions of this will have serious consequences, both for NATO and possibly for democracy and autocracy for many years to come. So it is a much bigger crisis than just Ukraine, what we're seeing.
How do you see this playing out in the longer term? I mean, you've got obviously these twin crises, just of public health and the refugees. How do you see those playing out in the future? In
terms of the end game, my guess would be as good as yours. And what I've been reading, I mean, it's so difficult to know. What's going to be important and what everyone is doing is thinking out of the different scenarios of what may happen. That'll be hugely important. But this will be beyond it's public health is core, but so is protection, so is nutrition, so are livelihoods and water, sanitation. Everything is going to be affected, and then eventually we hope there'll be some sort of rebuilding. I mean, so this will be likely a generation that will be affected some way and another. And the experience that we've seen is once people leave a country, especially in a welcoming country, if they're not forced to return, they may not return as quickly. Of course, everyone wants to go back to their home eventually, but there generally needs to be a home to go back to. And with the destruction that we see and will likely see over the next little bit, this is going to be a long-term situation. Yet most countries that receive refugees don't understandably like to think like that. So they may be thinking short-term, but history has shown that a lot of this ends up being long-term. And I'll just say, we haven't even considered yet, if this is longer term, where are these people going to be? We want to avoid camp-like situations, but how are you going to absorb 4 million or so Ukrainians throughout Europe? It's going to be a big logistical challenge.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to hearing more from your trip to Poland and what you see on the ground. Paul Spiegel, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Stephanie.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Niall Owen McClusker, Matthew Martin, Spencer Greer, and Holly Cardinal, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media support from Grace Holz Fernandez. Thank you for listening.